What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to be going over another episode of our Super Smash Brothers and Platform Fighter tutorial series. So in this episode we're going back to items, and specifically what we're going to be doing is covering some of our advanced behavior for gravity projectile movement. This way, when we already throw or drop an item, we can then continue to use the item in the future. Because before, what would happen if I come into the game, pick up the sword and drop it, it would not fall to the ground. There would be no gravity. So it could fall to the ground the first time if you set up gravity on the projectile movement component, but past that, every time you dropped it, it would not go to the ground, which we're fixing that today, so it's going to continuously go to the ground. Also, when you were to throw an item, it would only allow you to throw it once. If you threw it one time, it would use the velocity, it would rotate, and then after that, it would just sit in the air and rotate if you did the same logic to throw a second time. And we're going to fix that up today. I'm actually going to do that part a little bit live with you because of the changes that we're using. I want to show you everywhere we got to do it, and so I didn't do that beforehand. So right now that doesn't actually work, but it will by the end of the episode. Some other notes: I've actually made the sword a lot shorter just so it's a little bit more reasonable. It's still very, very big. I left the swords that are spawn, the same as the original, so you can see the difference here. I'm just demonstrating. That was the old sword. You see how much taller it is than me. This is the new one. That's not required for any reason. I just did it because I thought it was a little bit excessive. In the next episode, I'll fix it where all the swords are this size. But I wanted to point that out. It's not a bug or anything that was introduced. I literally changed the scale. If you want to see that, you can see now that my static mesh, specifically on the sword BP, I've just given it a scale of 0.5. Alright? So that's all I changed with that, and that's why things may look different, and why they look different from the ones that are spawned. Alright, so now we can go ahead and get started with the actual logic of today's episode, but before we do, if you'd like to get caught up in the series, I believe we're on episode 40 of the Super Smash Bros. And Platform Fighter tutorial series. I have a playlist right here in the top right corner. You can click this iCard, and it'll bring you to every episode we've done to get to this point. And it also will continuously be added to as we make more episodes. So you'll be able to follow that playlist and see exactly where we're at in the series. Alternatively, if you just care about item usage and how we set up our items in the series, I'll link you to part 1 of items in this tutorial series. Alright, now we're going to get started. So, the main things we have to do today are fix up our gravity mechanics and our projectile movement component. Those are the main things that are handling our control over these items and what they actually do when we pick them up or when we drop them. With that said, there's two things I want to do first, because these two things fix up tiny little bugs that still existed from other episodes that aren't really related to things we're going to cover today. So I just want to fix them up so that they are not here and bothering us while we're testing our other stuff. So both of these are in the base weapon BP. So we have base item BP and base weapon BP if you've been following the series. I know neither of these will have a mesh right now. That's by design because we can put any mesh we want in here. But remember the difference. A weapon is an item. So all weapons are items, but not all items are weapons. So consumables, like if we eat some food and gain some health back, we don't have to call it a weapon. So with them being different, we have two different classes. And the base weapon BP is the one that handled the attachment and the using right now, simply because the consumables, like I keep mentioning the food, for example, if it's on the ground and you interact with it, I just use it right away. And so we don't actually attach it. So I never had it attached for an item, but that doesn't mean you couldn't have it. Doesn't mean that we won't have it in the future if we need it. Basically, go to wherever our attached weapon item is, and we want to add a stop projectile movement here. Right at the front. We did have logic in here to fix attachment, so it was always attaching in the same spot, but that's all we had. We never stopped the projectile movement. We want to call stop projectile movement when we attach now, because what this allows us to do is if an object is rotating, right, if it gets stuck in a rotation like this and never stops for whatever reason, could be a bug, could be intentional, like it was caught in the air, if that's a possibility for you, we want to make sure that it's not still rotating when we attach it to the character. So add stop projectile movement, and that's a function that we have in our base item BP that you've seen plenty of times by now if you've been watching the series. Basically, we stop movement immediately on the projectile movement component and also reset the rotation rate, and then do some additional stuff that is useful for us for collision and how it should rotate to make it look the best. But long story short, adding that one function call here will cause it'll make our lives a lot easier because we won't have to deal with rotational issues just because we simply never called this function when attaching. All right. And the other thing is an event use item in base weapon BP. We were setting owner, but that doesn't really make sense because in the code, if we go to our basic attack, which is the button we press to equip items, if we don't have an equipped item and we are overlapping an item, we equip it and then we set the owner of it. Well, if we already set the owner, we don't have to do it again in the blueprint. So I'm just going to get rid of this one altogether. And I'm going to move everything over. I'll get rid of this reroute node and just position everything nicely. That won't really cause any issues, but just doesn't need to be there. Now with those things fixed, we can go into our base item BP and we can take a look at one final thing. This isn't necessarily a bug, but something that I just think should have been implemented. So if we throw our object and it goes and it hits an opponent, another character. So if the state is thrown and a character was hit on the damage collider, that character takes damage. And then we set the state to collided and stop the projectile movement. So what this looks like is if we threw our sword and it hits an opponent, it stops in place. This way we know we collided, we want to bounce back and land on the ground, that sort of behavior. With that in mind, we need to make sure that this also happens if we hit something like the wall or the ground, because we don't necessarily want it to continue going. This could be different for each weapon. So for example, if we hit the ground, it might be an object that rolls. You don't want it to necessarily just stop in place. We'll probably have to add a boolean for that. I'm thinking of like a barrel. If you throw a barrel, it could roll and it could stay along the ground. It would not stop the projectile movement, and then it would continue and hit an opponent. So you could have differing logic, but for some of it, like the sword, I do want it to stop if we hit another solid object. Now right now I haven't cast to a specific type, but I could check and see like floor, wall, ceiling. I could do a component tag. For now, I'm just adding default logic so we have something. That way we know if a collision occurs. I'm doing this on the static mesh as a whole. It's not the damage collider. You might want to keep it as the damage collider if you've set this up specifically. Like my damage collider is this, so it's a little bit bigger than my mesh, mainly for visuals and also for balancing purposes. You could change this even if the size of this changes. You might want to change the damage collider to not be the whole thing, that sort of thing. So what I've done is I've just grabbed the static mesh, scroll down to the bottom, and selected on component hit. Then anytime this mesh collides with anything, we go ahead and do this logic. Now this I copied from when a collision from a throw is encountered. So on our on component begin overlap on the damage collider, we have state equals thrown, branch. Now I haven't done the take damage there because what's taking damage? Not a player, so we're not doing that. So I have these three nodes, then I set the state to be collided, and I stop projectile movement. I copied those and I pasted them here. But essentially what is going on, so if the static mesh collides with anything, we go ahead and check if the state of the item is thrown currently. And if it is, I'm setting the state to be collided instead, and then I'm stopping projectile movement. Basically, if we hit any sort of object, we're going to stop our movement, the same as if we hit a character. This is good enough for now. We can make this logic more advanced in the future, but this does everything we need to for now. This way it doesn't necessarily go through objects, and we also have more control over when objects stop, because depending on the type of collision, the projectile movement could stop, and because of that, you could get this object that's flying in the air, hits an object, the projectile movement stops, but the game, or really the item, doesn't realize that it should just be done and go to the default state, or the collided state. And so it'll just hang out in the air, and we don't really want that either. So this is just another nice, helpful case that's going to make our lives easier when testing things. And now we can get into the important additions for today's episode. And that's going to be setting up gravity and allowing us to reuse items and redrop items and still allow them to work with the correct projectile movement. The rotational movement actually already works along with the rotating movement component. But the projectile movement, when it gets stopped, it no longer works. If you pick it up, it will not get the same conditions back. So if you initially put gravity on the gravity scale, it will fall to the ground when you come into the scene, right? So if I come in here, select my character, you see that everything fell to the ground. It spawned in the air, but everything fell to the ground. Before, if you would drop it, it would just stay right there and it would not fall to the ground. All right, even with a projectile gravity scale of 1. So what we need to do is create a new projectile movement every time we do this with the values we want, and then we can get rid of the old ones. So the reason I mentioned earlier that I wanted to do this live is because there's going to be quite a few changes with our projectile movement component, and I didn't want to confuse anybody because I've made a variable here, and I've called it projectile movement ref. And we're going to be using this for our values and our data more so than our standard projectile movement component on here. We can keep this component on here as a default value, and it will hold all of the values we want for our items. However, whenever we need to use another one, we're going to create another one and then pass it the correct data. So let's start with the drop because the drop is the easiest. All we care about right now is gravity. So we had all this data in here, all this logic in here when we dropped our item. Detached it, set the character not have an equipped item, reset the item type on the character, I then stopped the projectile movement. So if it had any sort of velocity or rotation, that's done. But it would never fall to the ground because, like I keep mentioning, the projectile movement would only fire one time. So when it was spawned, it would use up this gravity and it wouldn't do anything else. Now, your projectile gravity scale might be 0 because I had set it to 0 to avoid that issue. I did end up changing it back to 1.0, so just make sure when you come into your base at MVP, projectile movement has a projectile gravity scale of 1.0. This will allow it to fall as soon as it enters the scene and have gravity initially. Going forward, like I said, we're going to need to create a new one and set that to a variable so we can keep track of it and we can use that in the future. So this is the part we're going to do somewhat live. I did add these two nodes. But in your event drop item, you can go ahead and start with this. And I'll go over the rest as we show it. So you can add different types of components simply by searching add projectile movement component or add the type of component that you'd like to add. So we can literally create a new one and add it to this object. So if you type add projectile movement component, you get this node right here. It has a return, which returns the projectile movement component. But if you click on this node, you can actually see all the values of the projectile movement component. So we can manually choose what we want to do. When we're dropping it, we know we want to have a gravity scale of 1.0. I've also gone ahead and zeroed the velocity because I don't want any default velocity on any axis. I just want to worry about the gravity. So I've left everything else alone. But you can change everything about a standard component here. And then when it returns it, you'll get the result with all these values set. Technically, you don't have to set a reference here. It will still work without it. This reference isn't currently doing anything yet. But what I'd like to do is drag off of the projectile movement component, the return value here, and say promote to variable. And then I call this projectile movement ref, or you can make a variable. You can actually find this as a type. So you can just search projectile movement component, grab an object reference. Since I already had that one, I just deleted that new variable that I made. That was just a temporary variable. And I'm going to set it to the return value from this node. Now what this does is we can actually use this going forward when we're setting variables like the velocity on the projectile movement. So let's test this out, okay? Because right now throws don't work because we're still setting the velocity off the projectile movement alone, right? So just doing these two nodes, you should be able to go into your game. You should be able to pick up an item, drop it. It should have gravity as long as you've made sure the gravity scale, the projectile gravity scale is 1.0 on this new projectile component. It should have gravity. You should be able to pick it up, drop it as many times as you want, and it should function as you'd expect. That is great. There's another thing we want to do, and that's work on the throws, because throws would only work one time per weapon, per item. So say we throw an item. If we throw an item, what was happening was the item would be thrown. If it collided with something, it would stay where it was. There would be no gravity, and there would be... You could pick it up again, but if you threw it, it would just rotate in place. So, you probably guessed it, but before we set the velocity in the throw item function, we can go ahead and add a projectile movement component and set the projectile movement ref to this new component. Alright, so I use the same two nodes. This time I have a projectile gravity scale of 0 because when throwing items, I don't want there to be any gravity right now. That can easily be changed. You can give it a little bit of gravity. You can give it a little bit of downward velocity as well to kind of fake that gravity. So that's up to you how you do that. But for me, I'm turning off gravity, just like my throws always have been. I'm resetting my velocity to 0 here because I don't have a defined rate right now. I'm setting them here, but again, I'm determining that based off of other things. So I'm not setting a default value for velocity. So I'm going to give the velocity 0 on this new projectile movement component. And I haven't changed anything else about this. Then I set the same variable, the projectile movement component ref, to this component. Now, before we were using projectile movement. We were using the actual projectile movement component here, not the projectile movement ref variable, okay? If we only use this, this will never work for more than one time. That's the issue we've been running into. What we can do is find all instances of this. So if you right-click and find references on projectile movement, you see we use it here in the throw item function and here in the stop projectile movement function. All right. So with those in mind, what we need to do is replace these with our projectile movement reference. All right, so I can actually get rid of the projectile movement variable here and instead grab the projectile movement reference, get it, and pass it in. Now, it should be valid here pretty much no matter what, but if it's not, you could do a validated get and make sure that it is. We are setting it right here, so the only way this can't be valid is if this fails to create. But if you'd like to be extra safe, you can do a validated get. I'm not going to add it right now. Now let's go ahead and just test this out and see what it looks like without doing anything more. We're not done yet, but let's see what the changes are. So now I can pick up my item and I can throw my item successfully. It doesn't stop, and that's because the stop projectile movement is being called on the projectile movement component, not the projectile movement reference. So I want to grab my projectile movement reference, and on my stop projectile movement, instead of using the standard component, we want to use our new variable. However, on this one, it's very possible stop projectile movement could be called, and this reference does not exist. If we ever delete the projectile movement reference or the actual component to clean up, since we are adding components, we might want to clean some up and delete them to make the item take up less memory in the game. Then this could actually be null before stopping the movement. There's a bunch of different circumstances because it could go off the stage before the movement is stopped. It could be destroyed before the movement is stopped. It could just hit a wall. We have a lot of different options here. So we can just go ahead and call stop movement immediately on the projectile movement reference, but we want to make sure that this time it is valid. So I am going to do my validated get here. Bring this up here. And only if it's valid do I want to call this. If it's not valid, we could still continue on, okay? So we could still go to the rotation rate and the other logic. We're not using the projectile movement anymore in here, so we still may want to set certain things on this item. So I'm going to go ahead and still go to the rotation rate next. And I'm going to clean this up a little bit more. Just like that. Something like that is probably good. It's kind of bugging me though. So there we go. Now we make sure that this is valid before calling stop movement immediately. There's still going to be a bug with this. All right, we'll fix it. But let's take a look and see what happens so we can see it in action. So now we have the gravity initially, and we can throw our weapon still. When it stops, it does stop on the correct reference, and that's good to go. However, technically, say you have an item that rolls or an item that could land and have to bounce or do other things, right? Because depending on where it hit, if it lands on a hill, it might roll. You could have something that, like, I'm thinking like the bombs in Super Smash Brothers, where they can fall at different points and collide with objects on their way down. Because of this sort of behavior, our projectile movement reference should also be set correctly the first time around. Right now, the projectile movement component goes first and a reference is not set to it. The only time this is set is when we drop an item or throw an item. What I'd recommend is at the very start, so event construct, or event begin play, event begin play, we can go ahead and actually grab the projectile movement and set it to the projectile movement reference. By doing this, we set the reference to the component that already exists on the object. So this way, when it spawns in, it already has this reference right here. So when we play the game, it has the reference set up correctly, but we can still drop it when we create a new one, and we can still throw it when we're ready. See that it's stopped now? I want to create it, and I want to throw it back the other way, and you can see I throw it both ways now. This item is working as intended. I can continuously pick it up and use it for more and more things. All right, now there's one other case we have to deal with here, and that's when we collide with an object. We still want to enable gravity on the item, because if we don't, you saw how it was just flying in the air, floating in the air there, because it collided with the enemy, and we stopped the projectile movement, but we never added a projectile movement component for the gravity. So what I'd recommend is this. We have our begin overlap with the damage collider that I just mentioned to you earlier, where we call take damage on the opponent and set the state to be collided, and then stop projectile movement. After stopping the old projectile movement, what I want to do is make a new projectile movement component. Okay. I want to set it to a reference. And in this one, I do want to set the gravity scale to be 1.0. I don't need any velocity, so I'm leaving velocity as all zeros. Okay, so when we do this, we can now throw our weapon. It can hit an opponent, and then it will still get gravity afterward. And you can see it does, and it falls onto the platform, working completely as expected. Perfect. I might be able to throw it at this guy. Let's see if I can do it right. You ready? It should hit. Boom. And there we go. All right, so this is working perfectly. If you'd like, go ahead and copy this over to the on-component hit for the static mesh as well, just in case it hits a wall and the projectile movement component doesn't stop it. You may want to do this one final time, and then just have the projectile gravity scale 1.0, no velocity. That way, if you are to hit another object, like I said, and for whatever reason the projectile movement component does not fire, then you can still trigger this. But if we, say, throw it and it hits the ground, because this sword is still really long, if it hits the ground, we want to cancel it. We'll fix that in the future, because I don't want throws on the ground to hit the object, but this is actually working as intended, because if it hits the ground like that, we probably do want it to reset. Because assuming you have any gravity and it collides with the ground, that is the behavior that you'd want. So right now you can test mainly with jumping if you do this. But there you go. So everything's working as expected with our throws. One thing I would recommend that we actually haven't done even for the standard projectile movement is to constrain the movement to a plane just like we do with our characters. I would recommend this because if you don't, then you get that issue where they could actually go different X values. So they could come out, they could come closer to the camera or farther away, and your character could actually not be able to reach it depending on where it goes. So on the character, if we go into that, and we look at the character movement component, we have constraints. We scroll down. right here. Planar movement, we constrain to plane and we have it as custom. We have the plane constraint normal x of 1, meaning that it cannot move from that value on the x. 1 is just locked, right? So it's basically saying, here's an example you can read, but essentially what it's saying, if this is 1, it means that it cannot move on this axis. So what you have to do is, or what you can do to fix that, is go into your projectile movement component that you set on at the beginning, and I would constrain it to plane, and I would choose the plane constraint normal to be 1.0. All the other add projectile movement components that we add in today's episode, you can click find references to find them all. You can go to each of them, and I would do the same thing. I would constrain them to plane, and I would set them to be 1.0 on the plane constraint normal. Doing this makes it so that it cannot go out of bounds on the X for where the character can't reach it, because that can be ugly and it can be buggy and screw up things in your game, and you don't want that. So I recommend constraining them to that axis. That way that is not an issue. Now with all that stuff done, you should be able to play your game and you'll be pretty free now. This will really work well. You have a lot more freedom over your items. You have the ability to continuously use them, drop them, and they are working as you expect. Like, you can actually use them and pick them up, and it's not all buggy, and they're not rotating in the ground or rotating in your hand. There's a lot of good functionality here just by doing a few changes to those components that we had. So there we go, guys. That's how we can set up all this different logic for our items in our Super Smash Brothers and Platform Fighter tutorial series. So thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please subscribe. There's more for myself in the channel than anything else you can do. I just really appreciate it. I want to give a huge shout out to my YouTube membership and Patreon supporters and subscribers. I really, really appreciate it, guys. And you guys give me so much support. I'm so excited to work on these episodes for you week after week. Thank you so much. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. I'd be happy to assist you with any of the problems you had and get you rolling. But like I said, guys, that's all I got. So thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.